Hello everyone, Professor Philip Travis. This week in American history, we're actually going to be doing our paper proposals. I am going to talk a little bit about Lyndon Johnson here in just a moment, and this will be our extra credit this week. But this week we are not going to have a specific lecture, we're not going to have a discussion, we're not going to have any quizzes this week. Of course, the midterm exam I extended it into Tuesday of this week, so some of you might still be working on that. But the big thing I want us really undertaking this week is putting together our paper proposals for our research paper. Please see the paper guidelines, the assignment guidelines. I have a paper proposal checklist. I also have a list of some very, very general topics that you might want to think about when it comes to developing a paper topic and a proposal. So I want to talk about that just a moment, and then I'll talk a little bit about Lyndon Johnson here. And I'll talk about these images you see here, which will be our extra credit for this week, the Johnson stuff. I'll tell you about that in a second. So the paper proposal. So at the end of the term during exam week, we have a major research essay that we submit. And this is a 6 to 9 page essay. I want to see academic research on this. There's a minimum of 5 sources. That's a minimum. Typically, I'd like to see more than that. But a minimum of 5 academic sources, books, journal articles. Primary sources can also be great to see, particularly in an American history course. We have a lot of access to primary sources digitized online, so those as well, if you feel that they are going to really add to your argument. So the first step to writing this paper is to submit a paper proposal. And this is what I want to see on the paper proposal. Okay, I want to see the following. First, obviously at the top, say the subject. But after that, I want to see a thesis statement. So write the thesis statement out separately. Okay, I want to see the thesis statement first, whatever the thesis might be. Then I want to see you write a 2-paragraph introduction to the paper. So basically, in doing this, I mean, not to say you won't revise this, because as you develop the paper, I'm sure you'll revise this. But effectively, what you're doing right here is you're writing the introduction for your essay. Now, it's important to note, as you do research, as you work on this, sources are going to change. The thesis is going to change. Very often when we develop a thesis statement, it changes as we begin to delve into the research. But I want you to write an introduction to the essay. The introduction, and this is laid out in the guidelines that you'll find in the modules for this week, the introduction should be a 2-paragraph introduction. Paragraph 1 should be what we call a narrative hook. So find an interesting, compelling, first-hand account of whatever the subject is that you're writing about, and paraphrase, use that account to draw the reader in by giving a sort of interesting and compelling first-hand account about whatever the particular subject matter is, right? If you were doing, for example, something related to the civil rights movement, a compelling account of civil rights leaders marching across the Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama, facing down the Alabama authorities on the other side, could be a really compelling, hook to draw the reader in. Then on the second paragraph, this is your argument paragraph, and the argument paragraph is where you basically explain what the paper is about, and you're going to more or less say, why is this paper important? Why is this paper important to do? And then you'll present a thesis statement. You might propose a question, though when you propose questions, you want to make sure that if you propose a question, don't propose multiple questions usually, but maybe one question. If you propose a question, make sure it's a specific question, right? You don't want it to be a question like, what were the events at the beginning of the Cold War, right? That's just kind of a trivia type of question, and it's too broad, right? You want the question to be focused, and you want the answer of that question to be your thesis statement. And the thesis statement needs to be something. It should not be something that is a statement of fact. It should not be a general summary. A thesis statement should be a historical point that requires demonstration with evidence. It doesn't have to be something that has never been said before. You can make an argument in your own way that has been made before. But it needs to be something that is worth demonstrating, right? So you want, and I really encourage us to look at some of the readings we've already kind of looked at, the May reading, the Chester Pack reading on Vietnam, because they both present, pretty concise examples of a thesis that really requires the reader to develop in the body or discover in the body of the paper the historical evidence to prove that thesis, right? Sometimes when you're thinking about a thesis, you might think about, consider commonly held misconceptions that society has. I think Chester Pack does that in his article about news journalism, where basically, society has a certain perception about the role of media during the Vietnam War. And I'm not going to say too much because some of you might be still taking the test, but they have certain perceptions about the role of the media in the Vietnam War, and Pack basically develops, through his research, he proves a thesis that really refutes that as a misconception about the media and its role in the Vietnam War. So make sure your thesis statement is concise, make sure it's specific, and it is something that needs evidence to demonstrate. And when you're thinking about that, again, there's different ways to think about it, but you can oftentimes think about, how this might refute commonly held misconceptions in society. You don't have to think about it that way, but that is one way to sort of, consider things like this. But you don't have to do that. You could write a paper about the manner in which the Vietnam War has ultimately altered the way that the United States government interprets the war powers' rights in the Constitution that's delegated, of course, to Congress. And so you could have a paper that paper, of course, would focus very much on the Gulf of Tonkin incident and Gulf of Tonkin resolution, for example. Okay. So I want a bibliography, too, with the paper proposal. So Chicago style, I've got links in there for the free Chicago style guide online, and that should be more than enough for us to do our most basic citations. If you're getting into a more elaborate citation with a research archive, you can reach out to me. I'll give you some examples. Do the best you can with that. But if you are looking at an archival source, feel free to reach out to me if you don't have the full Turabian Chicago-style guide, and I'll be happy to give you some pointers on that. So, bibliography in Chicago style, 2-paragraph introduction, narrative hook, argument paragraph, and a thesis statement with your subject. That's our paper proposal. All right, so after we do our paper proposal, next week, the following week, we're going to be looking at really, we're going to look at the 60s in terms of major social movements in the 60s. We're going to look at the anti-war movement. We're going to look at the civil rights movement again in the later 60s. We're going to look at the women's movement as well. And in contrast to that, we're going to look at 1968 as a really critical turning point in American political society. And against the backdrop of 1968 and a myriad of social activism and uprisings in the United States, activism in the United States, I don't know if uprising is the right term, we will then also contrast that with the rise of the modern conservative movement. So next week, we're going to get into this major turning point that really occurs in the late 60s, in which you see the New Deal coalition, if you will, the coalition of New Deal liberalism in the United States really fracture as a movement generally called the New Left would emerge. And as it emerged and sort of broke off from the old New Deal liberal coalition, you had the emergence of what came to be known as the modern conservative movement, as you had a myriad of different groups, evangelicals, libertarians, some of your more moderate Democrats join forces with Republicans and begin to create the basis for the modern conservative movement. And that'll be a theme we'll talk more about, particularly when we get to the 80s, but we're going to think about the late 60s as an important turning point next week. So we're going to talk a lot about the anti-war movement, social movements, these types of things, as well as the rise of modern conservatism next week. The factoid for this week is about Lyndon Johnson. And I'll try to make this not too long. Lyndon Johnson, he, in many ways, as a president, Lyndon Johnson is kind of a tragic figure. Lyndon Johnson made many significant contributions to American society. Lyndon Johnson viewed himself as a New Dealer, a New Deal liberal. He wanted, as his presidency, he wanted to create a more just, fair, and equal country. He wanted to end poverty. These were his great goals. He did not want to be a war president. But Johnson ultimately got kind of pulled into the Vietnam War, and that really was devastating to his presidency, and probably contributed through the stress to his tragic death only a few years after his presidency ended, as he died of a heart attack. Lyndon Johnson, immediately after the war, wasn't viewed very well. Historians have increasingly raised his sort of credibility, and he's now, Lyndon Johnson, every year professional historians around the country rank the presidents. And Lyndon Johnson, he's now ranked somewhere in the top, I think, 14 or something like this. And the reason is because while the controversy surrounding the Vietnam War and the tragedy that was the Vietnam War was a really grave mistake for the Johnson administration, Lyndon Johnson, though, in the long term, championed some developments in American society that are really invaluable contributions to American society. Here you see Lyndon Johnson. This is actually President Harry Truman right here. This is Hubert Humphrey back here. This is Johnson's wife, Lady Bird. This is Truman's wife. This is Lyndon Johnson signing the amendment to the Social Security Act that created Medicare. Lyndon Johnson also created Medicaid. These were part of his Great Society programs. And these helped to really contribute to one of the great successes of the age of New Deal liberalism, and that is a very significant rollback of poverty in the United States. The United States, during the age of New Deal liberalism, really achieved tremendous strides when it came to fighting to reduce poverty and want in the United States. By no means eliminating it, but when one looks at statistics from the 20th century, the successes in reducing poverty and homelessness and these types of things, lack of medical care and these types of things, lack of access to education, these are great successes for the United States. And Lyndon Johnson owns a good deal of responsibility for that. Certainly not one individual as a legislator, as a lawmaker, but he certainly gets a great deal of credibility or credit for these types of programs, Medicare and Medicaid, for health care. Johnson also made some very significant steps for education, civil rights. Here you see, of course, Johnson meeting with civil rights leaders. This is Martin Luther King Jr. here. Johnson would ultimately, in the spirit of John F. Kennedy, too, sign the Civil Rights Act of 1964, abolishing segregation, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Johnson also signed legislation to end racist-based immigration quotas for immigration that went back to the 1920s. So these are some pretty significant strides when it came to pursuing greater equal opportunity in the United States. Johnson, though, of course, we mentioned Kennedy was a high complexity thinker and Johnson was really a low complexity thinker, and that doesn't mean that he wasn't smart. Johnson actually, when it came to being a sort of politician in the U.S. legislative branch, he was a real powerhouse. He was the head of the Senate before he became vice president, and he really was a person who knew how to get things done. And he really was highly successful at getting things done. So it's not what that means to say a low complexity thinker. It means that when he made decisions, he really wanted people to sort of join with him and be loyal. And when the going got tough, he wanted them to be more loyal. And when he saw individuals turn, what he saw as them turning away from him, he interpreted this as disloyalty. And then he would treat you almost as an outsider. He would treat you almost like an enemy. So with the case of civil rights, Martin Luther King Jr., and we'll listen to this next week. We're going to listen to a bit of his speech next week. We're going to kind of take it apart. Martin Luther King Jr.'s speech. In 1967, he came out against the Vietnam War in a speech that was a real indictment of the United States and its conflict in Vietnam, and likewise the Johnson administration. And in response to that, Johnson basically started to view King as an enemy, and he had portfolios that the FBI kept on King. They were sort of tracking him. They were now viewing him as a potential sort of antagonistic figure against the administration, despite their successes in working together previously on really important landmark civil rights legislation. A similar thing happens with Robert McNamara. This is the Secretary of Defense. In 1968, 67, Robert McNamara starts to acknowledge that the bombing of Vietnam was not working. And Robert McNamara begins to question whether or not we should continue to bomb. And Johnson interpreted this as disloyalty, and he would basically drive Robert McNamara out of the Secretary of Defense. McNamara would go on to, I think, the World Bank after that. But McNamara was basically drummed out. Johnson suggested he had, quote, gotten soft. He was replaced with Clark Clifford. And only months later, Clark Clifford basically said the same thing to Johnson, which was really during the Tet Offensive of 1968. And that's when Johnson would announce that he wasn't running again. But so Robert McNamara had demonstrated what Johnson saw as disloyalty to the program in Vietnam by saying that they should stop the bombing and seek peace negotiations because it wasn't working. The bombing was kind of McNamara's something that he had promoted, but Johnson saw him as turning away from it. So Johnson had this kind of character flaw that sort of hurt him in certain areas, even despite the fact that he championed some just landmark important measures for U.S. society that Americans benefit from to this day. Last little one, and I'll be quiet. I think I said I was going to make this short. I'm sorry. I'll figure out how to make these short one of these days. But so two interesting little points about Johnson. Johnson loved the soda Fresca, and he had a Fresca machine installed, like a fountain installed in the White House. And actually, to the point of his character, Johnson, when he was having conversations with people, had this tendency. He had some very unique ways of meeting and conversing with people who were his advisors. And he would get up in people's faces, and sometimes he would do this whether he was happy or mad. And it was called getting the Johnson treatment. So there are these photos out there of Johnson, like right up on somebody's face, and he's a tall person, and he's a big guy. And so he would be right up in people's face, and it would be called getting the Johnson treatment. And this is his way, and sometimes he was showing affection to the person, and sometimes he might have been trying to get them to fall in line. But getting the Johnson treatment, the Fresca machine, landmark legislative activities, and a character flaw as a leader, as a low complexity thinker that made him kind of a real tragic figure in American presidential history. So just summarize that this week, and maybe I'll give you a couple of points because these are long as opposed to 1 point. And let me know if you have any questions about the paper proposal, and let's have a great week.